It's not many times that a professional athlete makes me want to jump off a bridge. But Daniel Ricciardo makes me want to do exactly that. Daniel Ricciardo declining the way that he declined is because Daniel Ricciardo got paid to stop trying. Every year, for half a decade, Red Bull, Renault, and McLaren had to painfully sit back and watch as their other drivers and rival teams enjoyed victories despite having invested massive amounts of their budget in Ricciardo. These teams collectively flushed over $130 million down the drain on a driver who delivered exactly one win over 5 years. Today, I'm going to break down exactly how he did it, from his masterful exploitation of Red Bull's resources to build his reputation, to the Renault heist worth $50 million, to the McLaren swindle that cost them a staggering $65 million, including his buyout.
Is that real sweat?
It's real sweat. I'm a high-performance athlete. Athletes sweat. Sweat, baby. Sweat, sweat.
Ricciardo's journey began in the junior ranks, where he showed tremendous promise. After impressing in Formula Renault, he caught the eye of Helmut Marko and joined the Red Bull Junior team. It was around this time that the Red Bull Junior team stopped being composed entirely of Austrians, but they were not willing to stray too far from the path, so an Australian seemed close enough, and Marko saw potential. At the end of 2007, Marko approached the Ricciardos to ask if they were cool with not having to pay for racing anymore and get the best engineers to work with their son. Rising through British F3 and the World Series by Renault, where he battled Mikhail Alishin for the title, Ricciardo was already marked for F1 greatness. The funny thing is, when you look back on his career now, it's like watching someone peak before they even got started. I suppose that's the case with a lot of F1 drivers though, isn't it? He made his F1 debut with the backmarker HRT team in 2011 in a car described as the total opposite of a race car. The team itself was run by a consortium of people who had no business running a food store at a county fair, never mind a Formula One team. I mean, seriously, have you ever seen that HRT car? It looked horrendous. Despite this humble beginning, he impressed enough to earn a proper seat with Toro Rosso in 2012. And where better to score your first F1 points than at home, right? Coming across the line in 9th place at Albert Park, Ricciardo drew first blood in the teammate war at Toro Rosso. To be fair to Ricciardo, he masterfully calculated his value during these early years, finishing the 2013 season ahead of teammate Jean-Eric Vergne. Even Vergne's 6th place finish in Montreal couldn't save him in the points game. Ricciardo's strategic performance that year was convincing enough to be promoted to the main Red Bull team for 2014, replacing fellow Australian Mark Webber.
It's great to confirm Daniel as the driver replacing Mark Webber. He's a product of the Red Bull Junior program.
This risk paid off beautifully for Red Bull, as the first half of the 2014 season for Ricciardo was his best season as a pro. When paired against four-time champion Sebastian Vettel, Ricciardo not only matched him, but outperformed him, winning 3 races in Canada, Hungary, and Belgium, while Vettel went winless. Canadian Grand Prix victory was particularly sweet. As fast as the Mercedes were that day, reliability wasn't exactly their strength. Hamilton went out with brake issues. Rosberg had his own problems, but was still in the lead. That was until, with a handful of laps to go, his mirrors became full of Red Bull. Ricciardo just made an audacious move on Perez to get up into second place. But when it came to Rosberg, he wouldn't need such acrobatics. Easy pass, and with this, Daniel Ricciardo cruised home to take his first career win, and became the 4th Australian in history to win a race in Formula One, after Jack Brabham, Alan Jones, and Mark Webber. He outscored Vettel 238 to 167 and finished 3rd in the championship. At the time, he was considered to be one of the most underrated drivers in the sport. His aggressive but measured overtaking style earned him the nickname Honey Badger, someone who appeared friendly outside the car but would steal your honey on track. Now, he didn't get the championship that year, but most believed it was only a matter of time before the rising star got to the top of the table. Contract year, Ricciardo was a demon unlike any other, but Red Bull was about to go through a transition period. They had a winless 2015, blaming unreliable Renault power units, but Ricciardo still managed to bounce back in 2016 and 2017 with occasional wins.
Us to stay together, but Max is about 200 meters in front of me, so...
However, the early warning signs of this guy being nothing but trouble came when young Max Verstappen joined the team mid-2016, winning his very first race for Red Bull at Barcelona. To have your new teammate, who is still very much a teenager, win his first race with a team over 40 seconds up the road from you is a bitter pill to swallow. The guy who would eventually go on to win multiple championships was showing his actual talent, and Ricciardo faced his first real challenge at Red Bull. By 2018, the tension between them was becoming evident, culminating in their dramatic collision in Baku that year. However, in Monaco, Ricciardo put on a masterclass. I would even call it a moment of redemption after his heartbreaking 2016 Monaco loss, when a pit stop blunder cost him certain victory. This time, he was untouchable in qualifying, the only driver to dip into the 110s, while Verstappen crashed in practice and started last. Leading from the start, his electric motor failed, costing him around 160 horsepower with 50-odd laps to go.
Losing power.
Keep driving until it blows. That was Red Bull's answer to this problem.
Daniel, you're doing a really good job, mate. It's really good stuff. We know it's hard, but you're doing a great job.
Will it get better?
Negative, Daniel. Negative.
Somehow, Ricciardo nursed the wounded car home, ahead of Sebastian Vettel's Ferrari, in what Christian Horner called
unbelievable. You have done an amazing job today. That is right up there with what Schumacher did in 1995. And this is payback for 2016.
But behind the scenes, the writing was on the wall. The lack of reliability was killing Ricciardo's championship hopes. He suffered 8 DNFs in 2018 alone, more than any other driver on the grid. The normally composed Honey Badger was starting to lose his cool. What's more, Max was now starting to recover from his rabid start to the season and was really hitting his stride. It seemed like Red Bull was losing interest in Ricciardo, and he, at the same time, was past his peak. It was time to jump the ship and secure his first bag.
Don't flirt with him.
I'm not going to.
The red flags were everywhere, but Renault, who were fighting for relevance in the F1 midfield, were somehow obsessed with Ricciardo anyway. So in the summer of 2018, Ricciardo stunned the paddock by announcing he would leave Red Bull for Renault in a deal worth approximately $50 million over 2 years, triple what Red Bull had been paying him. The news was so unexpected that Red Bull team principal Christian Horner nearly drove off the road when Ricciardo called to tell him. There were a couple of reasons the French paid so much for the Australian. Special advisor for Renault at that time, Alain Prost himself, admitted Ricciardo was more expensive than other drivers, but claimed he was worth it as a catalyst for the team. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that, well, it was viewed as the shortcut move. Ricciardo was 29, so Renault felt he was in his prime years, and his experience would accelerate their progress. You don't have to focus on car development that much. The driver would take care of it, Because that's definitely how Formula One works, right? Just throw money at one driver, and suddenly your midfield car transforms into a championship contender.
Can you win?
I will push for that. Then realistically, it's going to be difficult, obviously.
The cherry on top was that Ricciardo was an easygoing, unproblematic guy with tremendous marketing appeal thanks to Netflix Drive to Survive. Seriously, the amount of screen time this guy got, you'd think he was winning races every other weekend rather than struggling to get out of Q1. And by the way, I like Ricciardo's personality as much as the next guy, but this video is not about that Hollywood smile. It's about Ricciardo selling teams on the promise that he's the one over and over again. But Ricciardo getting this deal was simply a product of perfect timing. His peak as a driver came during his contract year, and the team he signed with was all but forced to give him what he wanted because they had backed themselves into a corner. By the time Renault sobered up and realized they'd made a terrible mistake, the contract was already in place. Ricciardo's motivation for the risky move wasn't just a paycheck, according to his public statements, which I don't believe for a second. In Ricciardo's mind, Renault offered both a fresh challenge and a team built around him. Basically the same structure as Lewis Hamilton leaving McLaren for Mercedes, a comparison that would prove laughably optimistic in hindsight. Ricciardo's contract was such a disastrous lapse in judgment that it can quite literally be bullet-pointed as a major reason why Renault never progressed as expected. While Mercedes continued dominating with Hamilton and Ferrari at least occasionally challenged for wins, Renault remained firmly entrenched in the midfield despite their enormous investment in Ricciardo. This deal tied Renault's arms behind their back, limiting their ability to invest in crucial car development and infrastructure. And not only that, but Ricciardo proved time and time again to be chronically unreliable in key moments when the team needed him to deliver. In fact, I can point to the exact time where Renault came to understand that Ricciardo was a sunken cost. In 2019, Ricciardo's first season with Renault, the results were nowhere near what was promised. In his first 4 races with the team, he recorded 3 DNFs and a single points finish. At the season-opening Australian Grand Prix, Ricciardo's home race, and a place where expectations for him were always enormous, he qualified a disappointing 12th before retiring with damage on the first lap, after an ill-advised excursion onto the grass destroyed his front wing. While occasionally showing flashes of his old form later in the season, such as his 4th place at Monza, Ricciardo consistently failed to deliver the podiums that his salary demanded. Yes, you've heard it here first. If you get paid 50 mil, it's fair to expect at least a couple of podiums, isn't it?
Hülkenberg.
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 Sag's mal ein bisschen männlich.
Hey!
Hülkenberg.
Hülkenberg.
His teammate, Nico Hülkenberg, was often close in performance despite earning far less. Ricciardo outqualified Hülkenberg 14-7 and outscored him 54-37. But Hülkenberg was getting only 4 mil a year. In a championship where Renault hoped to close the gap to the top teams, they actually fell from 4th in 2018 to 5th in 2019. By season's end, Ricciardo had accumulated just 54 points. For context, both Red Bull drivers that year scored over 100 points each. Even McLaren's Carlos Sainz managed 96 points in a supposedly worse car. I mean, don't listen to me, I'm not a driver. Former F1 champion Jacques Villeneuve commented mid-season that Ricciardo's switch must have been for the money. He's taken a gamble, but nobody can see Renault working out for him. The most unfair aspect of Ricciardo's entire Renault type was how, despite playing uninspired racing year after year, the team's highest paid driver was their least criticized. The motorsport media rarely called him out either because they didn't care or because they didn't know how bad it truly was. His infectious personality and status as a Drive to Survive fan favorite seemed to grant him immunity. While drivers like Gasly and Albon were mercilessly criticized for their Red Bull performances, Ricciardo's mediocre Renault stint was largely given a pass. Everybody continued to speak of him as a future champion, despite mounting evidence to the contrary.
A question for Mr. Crocodile Dandil. 1980, Alan.
However, the 2020 season did show some improvement. Ricciardo outqualified new teammate Esteban Ocon 15-2 and outscored him 119-62, including 2 podium finishes at the Nürburgring and Imola. These podiums were his first since his Red Bull days and provided momentary validation for Renault's investment. It took virtually half the season before Renault could be bothered turning up to work, but when the car improved, Ricciardo was dancing with it. He even managed to win a bet with team principal, who was forced to get a tattoo to commemorate Ricciardo's podium finish. So I don't think I'll get a tattoo just yet, but it would be cool to get to 20,000 subscribers by Formula 1 summer break. So if you like this video so far, don't forget to subscribe. With this kind of strong season, there was no reason for Ricciardo to stay at Renault any longer. The contract was up, and it was time to sell his soul to the highest bidder once more. In May 2020, before the COVID delayed season had even begun, Ricciardo announced he would join McLaren for 2021. Because obviously, the bag doesn't wait. Show one good season, sell to the highest bidder, keep it moving, keep the media happy. Nobody will remember your bad races. This early departure announcement left a bitter taste at Renault, with Abiteboul releasing a pointed statement emphasizing unity and commitment and the need for reciprocated confidence, diplomatic language that barely concealed his fury at being abandoned after just 2 seasons of their multi-year project. Ricciardo's decent showing in 2020, with those 2 podiums for Renault, got McLaren fans fired up. Zak Brown was initially ecstatic to snag the hottest driver on the market, a proven winner of 7 Grand Prix. Brown had convinced the McLaren board that Ricciardo was the missing piece that would elevate them from a midfield team to championship contenders. The cost was irrelevant, so they decided to lock him in for eye-watering $15 million a year. What did Ricciardo do? He opened up the 2021 season struggling massively against teammate Lando Norris. In the first 4 races, it was 3-1 to Norris in head-to-heads, but the performance gap was alarming. Norris scored a podium at Imola and consistently fought at the front of the midfield, while Ricciardo was stuck in the lower points positions. In a pivotal moment at Monaco, a track where Ricciardo had previously won in 2018, he was utterly humiliated. being lapped by Norris in the same car. Norris finished third, while Ricciardo limped home in 12th, over a lap behind. By the way, Norris was bagging only $9 million a year at that time.
I think Carlos and Lando were running second and third already before the race.
Ricciardo struggled to make sense of the McLaren's handling characteristics, especially under braking. Tracks with a high degree of slow corners were proving to be his kryptonite, with the car pushing on entry and compromising his exits. The knock-on effects throughout the entire lap left him falling behind Lando, and questions finally began to arise as to what was happening to Daniel Ricciardo. There was a 45-point gap between Norris and Ricciardo in the standings by the end of the year, partially saved by the Ricciardo win in Monza, which, to be fair to him, was actually a proper good drive. Even more damning was the comparison to Carlos Sainz, who had moved from McLaren to Ferrari. While Ricciardo struggled to adapt to the McLaren, Sainz seamlessly integrated at Ferrari, even standing on the podium 4 times. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Sainz, earning only half of Ricciardo's salary, delivered far more in his new environment. The very bold claim I made earlier that Daniel Ricciardo is the antithesis of a winning racing driver doesn't originate from these negatives, though. The real reason he should have never sniffed a contending team seat in his career is because he does not adapt. In all his years post-Red Bull, 89 races with Renault, McLaren, and RB Mini, Ricciardo failed to adapt his driving style to different cars. He consistently gave the bare minimum effort to understand the machinery and actively sought to blame the cars rather than himself. Take Lando Norris, for example. He openly admitted that McLaren was very unsuited to his own style as well, but he simply adapted. That's probably why he was quoted as having no sympathy for Ricciardo's difficulties. The killer instinct was gone, and leaving Red Bull was the turning point, after which Ricciardo never had a top car and gradually lost his edge. Helmut Marko's words, not mine, but honestly, the man's rarely been more right about anything. The last 2 years of Daniel Ricciardo's reign of terror at McLaren were especially painful because of how clear it was that he needed to go. McLaren's Zach Brown had gone from Ricciardo's biggest supporter to openly criticizing his performances in the media, admitting that Ricciardo had not met expectations and hinting at contract termination mechanisms. After the disappointment of 2021, McLaren had expected 2022 to provide a reset button for their struggling driver with all new car regulations. It was a reasonable assumption. New cars with different handling characteristics could erase Ricciardo's issues with the previous machine, but it wasn't to be. If anything, it was worse. In qualifying, the head-to-head was a staggering 22 in Norris's favor. In Imola, he crashed into Carlos Sainz on the first lap, ruining both their races, while Norris went on to score a podium. In Monaco, he slammed into the barriers in practice and never recovered his form. In Brazil, he inexplicably crashed into Kevin Magnussen on the opening lap, taking both cars out of the race. Ricciardo was regularly eliminated in Q1, while Norris made Q3. In races, the gap was just as pronounced. Norris scored 122 points to Ricciardo's 37, more than triple his teammates' tally. By mid-2022, McLaren's patience had completely run out, with a gap between Norris and Ricciardo growing to embarrassing levels, and the team losing crucial constructor points. McLaren made the difficult decision to buy out the remainder of Ricciardo's contract, reportedly at a cost of $20 million, to replace him with Piastri for 2023. To end the relationship early, we've had to write a big check, Zach Brown acknowledged. That reportedly led McLaren to build more performance safeguards into future driver contracts, now known as McLaren clauses.
I think it's a very, very difficult situation to be in. I think he's still one of the best drivers. I raced against him. I had the pleasure to race against him, and the not so pleasurable side of getting beaten by him.
By August 2022, McLaren officially announced that Ricciardo would leave the team at the end of the season. On top of sunk cost, Ricciardo's underperformance had a competitive price. In 2022, McLaren lost a tight battle for fourth in the Constructor Championship by just 14 points. That gap could have been easily closed if their second car was scoring anywhere near its potential. By this point, you had a higher chance of finding an F1 fan with Stockholm Syndrome for Nikita Mazepin than finding one who actually enjoyed watching Ricciardo race. Not his personality, but his actual racing. McLaren initially saw Ricciardo as an upgrade over Carlos Sainz. Instead, the team endured a net loss in competitiveness. Sainz went on to score numerous podiums and even win races at Ferrari, while McLaren slipped backward with Ricciardo. Nobody respected his performances anymore, and Ricciardo made sure to cement his legacy of failure in his final races with the team, often qualifying outside the top 15 and bringing home no points. In his final race for McLaren in Abu Dhabi, he finished a forgettable 9th, while Norris finished 6th. A fitting end to a partnership that had promised so much and delivered so little.
Alright, I'm Daniel, and this might look familiar. I'm back.
When he was dropped by McLaren, Ricciardo managed to secure a reserve driver role with Red Bull for 2023, just for his good media image, nothing else. Yes, Ricciardo was brought back to race for RB Mini, but how were his performances in that time? The objective was to basically leave teammate Yuki Tsunoda in the dust and potentially earn a return to the main Red Bull team, but largely it was Yuki who had the better of him. As the 2024 season went on, the results were marginally improving, but not enough. Marco was losing patience, and the door had begun to close on that second Red Bull seat. On the eve of the Singapore Grand Prix, Ricciardo was informed that by the US Grand Prix he would be replaced by Liam Lawson. The Formula One biggest thief had pulled off his final score, and his time in Formula One was finally coming to an end. Remember when he was telling Netflix, "I don't see the point in racing anymore"?
Like, ultimately, is it worth the risk?
Well, when you've bagged over $130 million in the last 5 years, there is absolutely no reason for you to race, unless you just want to be a champion, like Schumacher, Senna, Hamilton, and other greats. Are you willing to push yourself to the limit when life is good already? And that's exactly where I draw the line between a champion and a driver who's just in it to make it. I get it, we all liked his smile and his interviews, and I did too, but with $130 million earned in his career, 0 championships, and a team switch about every 2 years, Daniel Ricciardo should be remembered as a big bag chaser, besides being a nice guy. I know it's kind of controversial, but let me know in the comments if it's fair enough, and don't forget to subscribe.